The Italian marble was freezing against her bare thighs. She stared at the $9.99 piece of plastic. Two solid pink lines glared back at her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a relentless New England rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the penthouse. The storm was swallowing the city, blurring the sharp edges of the hyper-modern skyline into a gray, weeping smear. Sienna did not hear the wind howling against the steel framework of the building. She only heard the frantic, deafening rush of her own pulse echoing in her ears. Her hands trembled so violently that the small plastic stick tapped a frantic rhythm against her wedding ring. The diamond on her finger was heavy, flawless, and worth more than the entire city block where she had grown up. It was a symbol of her new life, a life built on the ashes of her shattered past. But the two pink lines on the cheap drugstore test were a terrifying bridge between the woman she used to be and the queen she was supposed to become. She was pregnant. A microscopic fuse of life had just been lit inside her. For years, Sienna had viewed her own body as a crime scene. It had been a landscape of fading bruises, fractured ribs, and silent, suffocating apologies. She had spent a lifetime gluing her dignity back together, piece by agonizing piece. After escaping the decaying Rust Belt nightmare of the South Side, she had survived by making herself small, by learning to breathe without making a sound. Now, she was carrying the heir to the most feared syndicate on the eastern seaboard. A sudden, sharp wave of nausea hit her, and she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold edge of the floating vanity. Her elbow knocked against a heavy glass bottle of imported bath oil. It plummeted to the floor, shattering into 100 glittering shards across the pristine white marble. The sharp crack of the breaking glass snapped her out of her paralysis. She gasped, instinctively stepping back, but her bare heel came down hard on a jagged piece of the broken bottle. A sharp sting bit into her flesh, followed immediately by the warm, slow trickle of blood. She did not cry out. Pain was an old friend, a familiar language she had spoken fluently long before she ever learned the language of wealth. Before she could reach down to pull the glass from her foot, the heavy oak door of the master suite opened. The air pressure in the room instantly shifted. It was a physical sensation, a sudden gravity that pulled all the oxygen toward the doorway. Tiernan had returned. Sienna's breath hitched in her throat as she scrambled to hide the pregnancy test. She shoved the plastic stick deep into the pocket of her silk robe, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Footsteps moved across the thick bedroom carpet, slow, deliberate, and completely unhurried. Tiernan appeared in the doorway of the master bathroom. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and impeccably tailored in a dark charcoal suit that cost more than a luxury car. His presence was overwhelming, a terrifying blend of absolute stillness and coiled, lethal violence. He did not rule his empire by shouting. His power lay in the quiet, devastating certainty that he could dismantle a man's life with a single, whispered command. His dark eyes swept over the bathroom, registering the shattered glass, the spilled oil, and finally, Sienna. He did not ask what had happened. His gaze locked onto the small pool of bright red blood gathering near her heel on the white marble. A muscle feathered in his jaw, the only outward sign of the fierce, borderline obsessive protective instinct that governed his every action toward her. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly over the broken glass. Sienna braced herself, a lingering ghost of her past trauma, expecting anger, expecting a reprimand for the mess. Instead, Tiernan dropped to his knees right in the center of the shattered glass. He ignored the sharp edges biting into the fabric of his tailored trousers. He reached out with hands that had ended lives, hands that were currently restructuring a criminal empire through blood and intimidation. Those same hands wrapped around her delicate ankle with a terrifyingly gentle reverence. He looked up at her, his expression a mask of calm, focused devotion. He asked her softly to hold onto his shoulder. Sienna placed her trembling hand on the solid, unyielding muscle of his shoulder beneath the expensive wool. He was a fortress, a man desperately trying to wash generations of blood money through legitimate Port Authority contracts just to build a safe world for her. With surgical precision, Tiernan used his thumb and forefinger to grip the edge of the glass shard embedded in her heel. He told her to take a breath. Before she could even inhale, he pulled the glass free in one smooth, painless motion. He tossed the bloody shard into the sink and reached for a thick, white towel from the heated rack. He pressed the warm cotton against the cut, applying firm, steady pressure to stop the bleeding. Sienna looked down at the top of his dark head, her chest tight with an overwhelming mixture of profound love and paralyzing fear. She felt the weight of the plastic test in her pocket pulling her down like an anchor. How could she tell this man, this beautiful, terrifying apex predator, that he was going to be a father? His world was currently a war zone of shifting loyalties and violent restructuring. Bringing a child into this glass cage of millions of dollars felt like painting a target on a newborn's back. Tiernan finished wrapping her foot and slowly stood up, towering over her. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the soft curve of her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she had not realized she shed. He asked her quietly if she was all right, his voice a deep, rumbling vibration that settled in her bones. Sienna forced a fragile smile and nodded, whispering that she was just clumsy today. His eyes searched hers for a long, agonizing moment, seeing past her words but choosing not to push. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, fiercely protective press of his lips against her skin. He told her he had to return to the boardroom, that the transition with the East Side ports was requiring his direct attention. He promised to be home before midnight, instructing her to rest and let the staff clean the floor. When he finally walked out of the bathroom, the suffocating weight of his presence lifted, leaving Sienna gasping for air. She was drowning in the sterile perfection of her new life. The penthouse, with its panoramic views of the gray harbor and its silent, invisible security detail, felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. She needed to breathe. She needed to feel the grit of the real world beneath her feet, just for an hour, to remind herself that she was still human. By early afternoon, the rain had settled into a cold, persistent drizzle. Sienna dressed in a simple pair of dark jeans, a heavy cashmere sweater, and a long, unassuming black wool coat. She bypassed the private elevator and walked down the sweeping glass staircase to the lower lobby. Garrick was waiting for her by the reinforced glass doors. He was Tiernan's shadow, the lead enforcer of the syndicate, and a man who communicated entirely through grunts and the terrifying sheer mass of his body. Thick, dark tribal tattoos crawled up the sides of his thick neck, disappearing into his closely cropped hairline. He operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a military drone, but Sienna knew he harbored a deep, unspoken loyalty toward her. He opened the heavy door for her, his eyes scanning the rain-slicked street with paranoid precision. Sienna told him she needed to go for a ride, that the walls of the penthouse were closing in on her. Garrick did not argue, nor did he ask for a destination. He simply nodded and led her toward the idling, heavily armored black SUV parked at the curb. The heavy door closed with a solid, vault-like thud, sealing them inside the soundproof, leather-lined cabin. Sienna stared out the tinted window as the vehicle glided away from the ultra-wealthy district. They drove through the gentrifying maritime metropolis, watching the scenery slowly decay. The towering glass penthouses and pristine corporate plazas gradually gave way to faded brick warehouses and crumbling overpasses. This was the old city, the Rust Belt industrial sector where the syndicate had first clawed its way to power. It was a place of opioid-riddled desperation, cheap neon signs, and cracked sidewalks slick with motor oil and rain. Sienna asked Garrick to take her to the south side. She saw his massive hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He warned her in a low, gravelly voice that the south side was not secure, that the rival factions were restless. Sienna quietly insisted, telling him she just needed a cup of coffee from a place that did not serve it in fine porcelain. Garrick let out a heavy breath through his nose, a sound of reluctant concession, and turned the heavy vehicle down a narrow, pothole-ridden street. They pulled up across from a dingy, faded brick building with a flickering neon sign that read the Rusty Spoon. It was a diner that looked like it had been slowly dying since the 1980s. The windows were fogged with condensation and the smell of stale grease. Sienna told Garrick she would only be 10 minutes. He put the SUV in park and stated flatly that he was coming inside with her. Sienna shook her head, her voice firm but pleading, asking him for just 5 minutes of normal, unmonitored breathing room. She pointed out that the diner was nearly empty. Just a few tired dock workers hunched over their plates. Garrick stared at the diner, his eyes calculating the sightlines and the exits. He finally agreed, but told her he would be standing right outside the door, and if she was not out in 10 minutes, he was coming in. Sienna pulled her coat tight around her and stepped out into the freezing, damp air. The smell of the south side hit her instantly, a mixture of wet asphalt, rotting sea kelp from the harbor, and cheap exhaust. It was a harsh, ugly smell, but it grounded her. She pushed open the heavy glass door of the Rusty Spoon. A small, tarnished brass bell above the door chimed, a pathetic, rattling sound that announced her arrival. The interior of the diner was exactly as she remembered from her past life. Faded red vinyl booths patched with silver duct tape lined the walls. The linoleum floor was scuffed and sticky, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions. Sienna walked to a small booth in the back corner, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat. A waitress with tired eyes and a stained apron approached, dropping a sticky, laminated menu on the table. Sienna ordered a decaf coffee, keeping her voice low, trying to blend into the faded background. She wrapped her hands around the thick, chipped ceramic mug when it arrived, letting the artificial heat seep into her cold fingers. For a few minutes, she just sat there, watching the rain streak down the dirty window pane. She closed her eyes, trying to process the monumental shift in her universe. She was going to be a mother. She was going to have to teach a child how to survive in a world built on extortion, violence, and blood. The rattling chime of the front doorbell shattered her quiet reflection. Sienna opened her eyes and glanced toward the entrance. Her blood instantly turned to ice in her veins. The air in her lungs vanished, replaced by a sudden, suffocating panic. Standing in the doorway, shaking the rain from his cheap, frayed jacket, was Braden. He was the decaying shell of the man who had terrorized her for 3 years. He looked worse than she remembered, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and erratic, fueled by cheap liquor and a pathetic, festering resentment. He was a ghost from the darkest chapter of her life, a walking nightmare of bruised egos and drunken rage. Sienna froze, her primal survival instincts screaming at her to make herself invisible, to shrink down into the vinyl booth. But it was too late. Braden turned his head, his bloodshot eyes scanning the diner, and he saw her. He stopped dead in his tracks. A slow, ugly smirk spread across his unshaven face, twisting his features into a mask of cruel recognition. He began to walk toward her booth, his boots squeaking against the wet linoleum. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrifying rhythm. She reached for her purse, her fingers trembling as she prepared to stand up and walk out. Braden reached the table before she could slide out of the booth. He slammed his hands down on the sticky table, leaning in close. The smell of him hit her like a physical blow, a nauseating wave of sour whiskey, stale cigarette smoke, and unwashed clothes. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the expensive cashmere of her sweater and the flawless diamond on her left hand. He sneered, his voice a harsh, grating whisper that dripped with venom. He asked her if she thought she was better than everyone else now, playing dress-up with the mob. Sienna kept her voice steady, though her hands were shaking violently beneath the table. She told him to walk away, warning him that he had no idea what he was doing. Braden laughed, a sharp, barking sound that drew the attention of the tired dock workers at the counter. His fragile ego, already battered by his own failures, snapped completely at the sight of her wealth and her quiet defiance. He told her she was nothing but a stray dog that found a richer master. Sienna slid across the vinyl, trying to stand up and push past him. She told him she was leaving. As she stood, Braden's hand shot out with terrifying speed. He grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging brutally into her flesh through the thick cashmere. The sudden, violent contact sent a shockwave of pure terror through Sienna's body. It was the exact same grip he had used 100 times before, the prelude to hours of agonizing pain. She gasped, trying to wrench her arm free, but he was fueled by a manic, desperate rage. He shoved her hard, slamming her back against the edge of the table. The ceramic coffee mug tipped over, spilling hot brown liquid across the laminated surface and onto the floor. Before Sienna could scream, Braden's other hand lunged forward. He grabbed her by the throat. It was his signature move of control, the ultimate assertion of his pathetic dominance. He squeezed, his dirty fingers pressing hard against her windpipe, instantly cutting off her air supply. Sienna's hands flew up, clawing desperately at his wrist, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his skin. Black spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. The diner around her faded into a terrifying, muffled blur. She was no longer the wife of a syndicate king. She was back in that cramped, freezing apartment on the south side, a helpless victim suffocating under the weight of a monster. But then, a new, primal terror ripped through her fading consciousness. It was not fear for her own life. It was a sudden, roaring, absolute terror for the microscopic fuse of life hidden deep inside her womb. The maternal instinct, dormant and unknown until this very morning, exploded into a violent, desperate need to protect. She managed to drag a tiny, ragged sliver of air into her crushed windpipe. She choked out a broken, desperate plea, begging him to stop, telling him about the baby. Braden's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, the information processing through the haze of his drunken rage. Then, a sick, twisted glee washed over his face. He leaned his face inches from hers, his sour breath washing over her skin. He laughed, a wet, horrifying sound, and tightened his grip on her throat. He whispered that he was going to beat the syndicate brat right out of her. Sienna's eyes rolled back, her lungs burning, her body going limp against the edge of the table. She thought she was going to die on the sticky floor of the rusty spoon. Then, the world exploded. The heavy glass door of the diner did not just open. It was violently, catastrophically forced inward, the metal frame buckling with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. The rattling brass bell tore loose from its mount and clattered across the linoleum. The air pressure in the diner vanished. Tiernan stepped through the shattered doorway. Garrick was right behind him, a massive, looming shadow of impending death. The pacing of the universe seemed to slow down to an agonizing crawl. The tired dock workers at the counter froze, their coffee cups halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing terror. They recognized the man in the charcoal suit. Everyone in the city recognized the devil when he walked into the room. Tiernan did not shout. He did not pull a weapon. He did not run. He walked toward the back booth with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. His face was completely devoid of human emotion. It was a mask of cold, absolute, apocalyptic rage. His dark eyes were locked onto Braden's hand, which was still wrapped around Sienna's throat. Braden felt the sudden, crushing silence in the room. He turned his head, his drunken bravado evaporating the second he made eye contact with Tiernan. The predator had entered the room, and Braden instantly realized he was nothing but prey. His hand went slack, dropping from Sienna's neck as if he had touched a live wire. Sienna collapsed against the booth, gasping violently for air, her hands flying to her bruised throat as she coughed. Braden took a stumbling step back, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some cowardly excuse, but the words died in his throat. Tiernan reached him. He did not throw a punch. He simply reached out and grabbed Braden by the front of his cheap jacket, lifting the man entirely off his feet with one hand. The sheer, terrifying strength of the movement defied logic. Tiernan slammed Braden backward against the faded brick wall of the diner. The impact shook the entire building, knocking a framed photograph off the wall to shatter on the floor. Tiernan leaned in, his face inches from Braden's terrified, sweating face. His voice was a quiet, lethal whisper that carried through the dead silence of the diner. He asked Braden what he had just said to his wife. Braden was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. In a desperate, suicidal bid for leverage, Braden's fragile ego made one final, fatal mistake. He spat blood onto the floor and sneered, his voice trembling but defiant. He told Tiernan that his wife was carrying a brat, and that she belonged to the gutter just like him. Time stopped. The words hung in the stale air of the diner, heavy and toxic. Sienna, still gasping for breath against the vinyl booth, squeezed her eyes shut in absolute horror. The secret was out. She opened her eyes and looked at her husband. She watched the exact moment the information registered in Tiernan's mind. The cold, calculating syndicate boss vanished. In his place stood a father who had just been told his unborn child had been threatened. The shift in his demeanor was terrifying to witness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tiernan slowly turned his head to look at Sienna. His dark eyes swept over her pale, terrified face, dropping to the angry red marks blooming on her throat, and finally resting on her stomach. A profound, rumbling tenderness flashed in his eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent vow of absolute protection. Then, he turned back to Braden. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a violence so pure and unyielding it made the air hum. Tiernan did not say another word. He systematically, surgically dismantled Braden's existence. He dropped Braden to the floor, letting the man crash onto his knees. Before Braden could scramble away, Tiernan brought his heavy leather shoe down on Braden's right hand. The sound of the bones crushing against the linoleum was a wet, sickening crunch that echoed off the walls. Braden let out a high, piercing scream of pure agony. Tiernan did not blink. He stepped down on the left hand, shattering it with the same cold, mechanical precision. He was ensuring that those hands would never, ever be able to grab his wife's throat again. Braden collapsed onto the sticky floor, a broken, gasping, sobbing mess of shattered bone and ruined pride. He curled into a fetal position, whimpering pathetically into the spilled coffee. Tiernan stood over him for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, smoothing the expensive wool as if he had merely swatted a fly. He turned his back on the broken man on the floor. He walked over to the booth where Sienna was trembling, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Tiernan shrugged off his heavy charcoal wool coat. He leaned down and wrapped the massive garment around her shaking shoulders, pulling the lapels tight across her chest. The coat smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and the faint, metallic tang of violence. It was a heavy, suffocating shield. He gently gathered her into his arms, lifting her easily from the booth. Sienna buried her face in his chest, her tears finally breaking free, soaking into his pristine white shirt. He carried her toward the shattered doorway of the diner. Garrick stepped aside, his massive frame blocking the view of the terrified patrons inside. As they walked out into the freezing, relentless rain, Sienna opened her eyes. She looked at Garrick, noticing the fresh, dark blood staining his massive knuckles from where he had dealt with Braden's lookout in the alley. She looked up at Tiernan's face, illuminated by the flickering neon sign of the diner. His eyes were completely devoid of humanity. They were filled only with the cold, calculating calculus of impending war. The realization crashed down on her with the weight of a collapsing building. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was carrying the heir to a monster. The violent, bloody restructuring of the syndicate was no longer just business. It was a desperate, ruthless crusade to build a fortress for their unborn child. The true war to keep this baby safe had only just begun. As they walked out into the freezing, relentless rain, Sienna opened her eyes. She looked at Garrick, noticing the fresh, dark blood staining his massive knuckles from where he had dealt with Braden's lookout in the alley. She looked up at Tiernan's face, illuminated by the flickering neon sign of the diner. His eyes were completely devoid of humanity. They were filled only with the cold, calculating calculus of impending war. The realization crashed down on her with the weight of a collapsing building. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was carrying the heir to a monster. The violent, bloody restructuring of the syndicate was no longer just business. It was a desperate, ruthless crusade to build a fortress for their unborn child. The true war to keep this baby safe had only just begun. The armored sport utility vehicle idled at the curb, its heavy engine a low, vibrating growl against the storm. Garrick pulled open the heavy rear door, the reinforced steel groaning softly under the weight of the armor plating. Tiernan guided her inside, his large hand resting firmly on the small of her back, a silent, immovable barrier between her and the decaying street. Sienna slid across the cold leather seat, pulling Tiernan's massive charcoal wool coat tighter around her trembling shoulders. The heavy door slammed shut, instantly cutting off the howling wind and the harsh, metallic sounds of the south side. The cabin of the vehicle was a soundproof vault, smelling of expensive leather and the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder. Tiernan slid in beside her, his presence consuming the confined space. He did not speak. He did not offer hollow words of comfort or empty reassurances. Instead, he reached across the center console and took her shaking hand in his. His knuckles were pale, the tendons in his forearm pulled tight as steel cables, but his grip on her fingers was terrifyingly gentle. Garrick climbed into the driver's seat, his massive frame shifting the suspension of the heavy vehicle. He put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the flickering neon sign of the rusty spoon behind in the rearview mirror. Sienna stared out the tinted window, watching the rain blur the faded brick buildings and the cracked, oil-slicked sidewalks. The adrenaline that had kept her conscious in the diner was beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. Her throat throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a phantom echo of Braden's filthy fingers crushing her windpipe. She swallowed hard, wincing as a sharp pain flared down her neck. Tiernan felt the slight flinch in her hand. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the angry red marks blooming across her pale skin. The muscle in his jaw feathered, a microscopic twitch that betrayed the apocalyptic rage still boiling just beneath his calm exterior. He pulled a sleek, encrypted phone from his inner jacket pocket and typed a single, brief message. He looked at Garrick through the rearview mirror and told him to make sure Dr. Mercer was waiting in the study when they arrived. Garrick offered a single, sharp nod, his eyes constantly scanning the rain-swept streets for any sign of a tail. The drive back to the financial district was a journey between two entirely different worlds. They left the opioid-riddled desperation of the industrial sector, crossing the invisible boundary into the hyper-modern, ultra-wealthy heart of the maritime metropolis. The crumbling overpasses gave way to pristine corporate plazas and towering glass monoliths that pierced the low-hanging storm clouds. This was the empire Tiernan was trying to conquer. A world of legitimate global logistics and high-rise boardrooms. It was a world he was determined to buy with the blood money of his ancestors, just to give her a clean place to stand. The vehicle descended into the subterranean parking garage of their building, passing through 3 separate layers of armed security. The heavy steel gates rolled shut behind them with a final, echoing clang, sealing them inside the fortress. They took the private elevator up to the penthouse, the high-speed ascent making Sienna's ears pop in the suffocating silence. When the polished steel doors slid open, the sterile, beautiful cage of their home stretched out before them. The penthouse was a masterpiece of imported Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and minimalist perfection. It was a place where millions of dollars had been spent to create an illusion of absolute safety. Dr. Mercer was already waiting in the expansive, dimly lit study. He was an older man with thinning gray hair, wearing a rumpled tweed suit that looked entirely out of place among the modern, expensive furniture. He was a disgraced physician, a man who had lost his medical license a decade ago for refusing to testify against the Old Blood Syndicate. He was pragmatic, incredibly calm, and the only medical professional Tiernan trusted with his life, and now, with his family. Mercer stood up from the leather armchair as they entered, his sharp eyes immediately assessing Sienna's pale face and the heavy coat draped over her. He did not ask about the blood on Tiernan's cuffs or the dark, violent energy radiating from the syndicate boss. He simply gestured toward a long velvet chaise lounge near the window and asked Sienna to sit down. Tiernan helped her out of his heavy coat, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a fraction of a second before he stepped back. He retreated to the far corner of the study, folding his arms across his chest, becoming a silent, brooding shadow watching over the room. Mercer opened his worn leather medical bag, the smell of sharp antiseptic cutting through the faint scent of rain and expensive cologne. He pulled out a small penlight and gently asked Sienna to tilt her head back. His fingers were cold and clinical as he examined the dark purple bruises forming in the shape of a handprint on her throat. He asked her to swallow, his eyes watching the movement of her muscles with practiced precision. Sienna winced, her hands gripping the edge of the velvet cushion. Mercer turned off the penlight and stated quietly that the physical trauma was superficial, that there was no severe damage to the trachea. He warned her that it would be painful to speak and swallow for a few days, but that the bruising would eventually fade. Then, the older doctor paused, his hands resting on the edge of his open medical bag. He looked at Sienna, his expression softening into something resembling grandfatherly concern. He lowered his voice, glancing briefly at the imposing shadow of Tiernan in the corner. Mercer asked her if there was anything else he needed to be aware of, any other trauma that required his attention. Sienna felt the air leave her lungs. The secret she had been carrying all morning, the microscopic fuse of life that had nearly been extinguished in a filthy diner, demanded to be acknowledged. She looked past the doctor, her eyes finding Tiernan in the dim light. He was perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto hers, waiting. Sienna took a shallow, trembling breath and looked back at Mercer. She whispered that she had taken a test that morning, and that it was positive. The silence in the study became absolute. It was a heavy, architectural silence, built on the sudden, monumental shift in the gravity of their world. Mercer did not show surprise. He simply nodded, his face a mask of calm professionalism. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, portable ultrasound monitor, a piece of high-end medical technology that looked completely out of place in his worn leather kit. He asked Sienna to lie back and lift the edge of her cashmere sweater. Sienna complied, her hands shaking as she exposed her flat, pale stomach to the cool air of the study. Mercer applied a dollop of cold, clear gel to the wand and pressed it gently against her skin. He turned the screen toward her, his eyes focused on the grainy, black and white static shifting across the small monitor. Tiernan stepped out of the shadows. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, stopping right beside the chaise lounge. He looked down at the small screen, his massive frame completely rigid, his breathing shallow and controlled. Mercer moved the wand slightly, his eyes narrowing as he searched the static. Then, he stopped. He pointed to a tiny, flickering pulse of light in the center of the dark screen. He stated quietly that she was approximately 6 weeks along, and that the heartbeat was strong and steady. Sienna stared at the flickering light, a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion crashing over her. It was real. The child was real. A tiny, fragile heartbeat echoing in the sterile silence of the glass fortress. A single tear slipped down her cheek, tracking through the lingering dust of the south side. She felt a heavy, warm weight settle onto her shoulder. Tiernan had placed his hand there, his fingers gripping her gently, anchoring her to the present moment. He stared at the monitor, his dark eyes reflecting the tiny pulsing light. For the first time since she had met him, the terrifying apex predator looked completely, utterly humbled. Mercer wiped the gel from her stomach and packed away his equipment with quiet efficiency. He handed Tiernan a small bottle of prenatal vitamins and gave him a list of strict dietary instructions. He told them he would return in a week for a full blood panel, and advised Sienna to rest and avoid any further stress. The irony of the doctor's words hung heavily in the air, a stark contrast to the violent reality of their existence. Garrick escorted the doctor out of the penthouse, leaving Sienna and Tiernan alone in the suffocating quiet. Sienna slowly sat up, pulling her sweater down, feeling the sudden, crushing weight of the psychological walls shaking around her. The physical trauma of the attack was minor, but the mental toll was a devastating landslide. She had spent years building a new identity, a quiet, elegant poise that shielded her from the horrors of her past. But in a matter of seconds, Braden had dragged her right back into the mud, reminding her of how easily a monster could take everything away. Tiernan watched her, his eyes tracking the subtle tremors in her hands and the haunted, distant look in her eyes. He reached down and gently took her arm, guiding her out of the study and down the long, marble hallway toward the master suite. The bedroom was a massive, cavernous space, dominated by a huge, custom-built bed and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the weeping city. The storm outside was intensifying, the rain lashing against the reinforced glass like handfuls of gravel. Tiernan led her to the edge of the bed and gently pushed her down to sit on the thick, silk duvet. He did not turn on the main lights, leaving the room bathed in the gray, atmospheric glow of the storm. He stood in front of her and began to systematically strip away his armor. He pulled the heavy silk tie from his neck, tossing it onto a nearby chair. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the dark leather shoulder holster strapped across his broad chest. He unclipped the holster, the heavy matte black firearm resting securely inside, and placed it carefully on the nightstand. He was shedding the terrifying persona of the syndicate boss, exposing the man underneath. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his pristine white shirt, the fabric stained with the dark, dried blood of the men who had dared to threaten his world. He rolled the sleeves up past his elbows, revealing the thick, corded muscles and the faded, jagged scars that mapped his violent history. Then, the immovable king dropped to his knees on the thick bedroom carpet. He positioned himself directly in front of Sienna, his broad shoulders level with her waist. He looked up at her, his dark eyes stripped of all their cold, calculating menace. They were filled with a raw, agonizing vulnerability that stole the breath from her lungs. He reached out with his large, scarred hands and gently rested them on her knees. He spoke, his voice a deep, rumbling vibration that barely rose above a whisper. He asked for her forgiveness. He told her he should have never let her leave the penthouse, that he should have burned that diner to the ground the moment she walked inside. Sienna shook her head, her hands reaching out to cup his rough, unshaven jaw. She whispered, her voice raspy and painful, that he came in time, that he always came in time. Tiernan closed his eyes, leaning his face into the warmth of her palms. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound loud and heavy in the quiet room. When he opened his eyes again, the vulnerability had hardened into a fierce, unbreakable resolve. He moved his hands from her knees, sliding them slowly up her thighs until his large palms rested flat against her stomach. The heat of his touch seeped through her clothing, a grounding, protective fire. He looked directly into her eyes and made a vow, his words carrying the weight of absolute, lethal certainty. He told her that his father had built the syndicate on blood, extortion, and fear, leaving behind a legacy of constant, paranoid warfare. He swore that he would not pass that legacy down to their child. He explained that the Port Authority contracts, the massive real estate acquisitions, the brutal restructuring of the old guard, it was all for this. He promised her that he was going to pull their family out of the mud, no matter how many men he had to bury to do it. He vowed to build a legitimate boardroom, a fortress of clean money and untouchable power, where their child would never have to look over their shoulder. He leaned in closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. He swore on his life, on his soul, that no one would ever touch her or the baby again. Sienna closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her, letting the sheer, terrifying force of his love anchor her shattered nerves. She knew the cost of his promise. She knew that to build a clean world, Tiernan was going to have to wade through a river of blood. But as she sat in the dim light of the glass fortress, feeling the steady, protective heat of his hands on her stomach, she finally accepted her reality. She was no longer a cowering victim. She was the queen of a dark empire, and she would stand by her king as he tore the underworld apart to protect their bloodline. 3 days passed. The atmosphere inside the penthouse shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a suffocating, high-pressure command center. The tension within the syndicate was palpable, a heavy, invisible weight that pressed against the reinforced glass windows. The old blood capos, the men who had run the streets with Tiernan's father, were growing restless. They resented the transition toward legitimate global logistics. They viewed the corporate contracts and the clean real estate deals as a betrayal of their violent roots, a sign of weakness in their new leader. Tiernan knew the friction was reaching a boiling point. He knew he had to assert his absolute dominance before the whispers of rebellion turned into a full-scale war. He orchestrated a dinner for his top lieutenants, a formal gathering designed to force the dissenting voices into the light. The penthouse was transformed. Garrick doubled the security detail, placing heavily armed men at every entrance, elevator shaft, and blind corner of the building. The massive dining room, usually a silent, empty space of polished mahogany and crystal, was prepared for a war council. Sienna remained in the private wing of the penthouse, instructed by Tiernan to stay out of sight, but she refused to hide completely. She stood in the shadows of the hallway, wearing a long, elegant black dress that concealed the tiny, secret life growing inside her. She watched as the heavy oak doors opened and the capos arrived. They were dangerous, hardened men, wearing expensive suits that could not hide the brutal, street-level grit of their pasts. They moved with a predatory grace, their eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing the wealth and the power of their young boss. Among them was Vance. He was a sharp, arrogant capo who ran the highly lucrative, deeply corrupt East Side ports. He was younger than the old guard, fueled by a reckless ambition and a deep-seated resentment of Tiernan's authority. Vance wore a suit that was slightly too flashy, his hair slicked back, his eyes darting around the room with a hungry, calculating gleam. He viewed Tiernan's push for legitimate business as a coward's retreat, a surrender of the power they had bled to acquire. More dangerously, Vance viewed Sienna as a vulnerability. He saw her as a distraction, a soft, fragile weakness that was blinding their king to the realities of the street. The men took their seats around the long mahogany table. The city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, a sprawling, indifferent backdrop to the deadly politics playing out in the room. Tiernan sat at the head of the table. He was a monument of terrifying stillness, his dark suit immaculate, his face an unreadable mask of cold authority. Vance took the seat to Tiernan's immediate right, a deliberate, arrogant claim to the position of second in command. The dinner began in a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the scrape of silver against porcelain. The air in the room was thick with unspoken threats and calculated disrespect. Tiernan spoke quietly, outlining the final phases of the Port Authority transition, detailing the massive influx of clean capital that would secure their future. Most of the older capos nodded slowly, their greed temporarily outweighing their nostalgia for the old, bloody ways. But Vance leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive red wine in his glass with a slow, mocking rhythm. He let out a low, dismissive chuckle that cut through the quiet murmur of the room like a gunshot. The table went dead silent. Every eye turned to the arrogant capo. Vance smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of his lips, and set his glass down on the polished wood. He looked directly at Tiernan, his voice dripping with a subtle, venomous disrespect. He stated that clean money was fine for politicians and bankers, but that the syndicate was built on fear, and fear required a king who was present on the streets. Tiernan did not react. He simply stared at Vance, his dark eyes completely flat, waiting for the man to hang himself with his own words. Vance, mistaking the silence for hesitation, pushed further. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, crossing the invisible line of survival. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of false, mocking concern. He said that the streets were talking. He mentioned that whispers were circulating about a king who left his throne unguarded to play savior in a filthy Southside diner. He stated that running errands to fetch a stray was a distraction, a vulnerability that made the entire family look weak to their rivals. The temperature in the dining room plummeted to absolute zero. The older capos froze, their breath catching in their throats, their survival instincts screaming at them to back away from the table. They knew what Vance had just done. He had insulted the wife of the devil in his own house. Sienna, watching from the shadows of the hallway, felt her heart stop. She saw the microscopic shift in Tiernan's posture, the sudden, terrifying coil of lethal energy that rippled through his massive frame. Tiernan did not yell. He did not argue. He moved with a sudden, explosive speed that defied his massive size. Before Vance could even register the danger, Tiernan's hand shot across the table. He grabbed Vance by the back of his slicked hair, his fingers digging into the man's scalp with crushing force. With a brutal, terrifying downward motion, Tiernan smashed Vance's face directly into the solid mahogany table. The acoustic shock of the impact was horrifying. The sickening crunch of shattering cartilage and breaking bone echoed off the glass walls of the penthouse. Vance's wine glass tipped over, the dark red liquid spilling across the polished wood, mixing instantly with the bright, hot blood pouring from his ruined nose. Vance let out a muffled, agonizing scream, his hands flying up to claw at the table, but Tiernan held him pinned down against the wood. The other capos shoved their chairs back, scrambling away from the table in absolute paralyzing terror. Tiernan leaned over the struggling, bleeding capo, his face inches from Vance's ear. His voice was a quiet, demonic whisper that carried clearly through the dead silence of the room. He made a lethal, public declaration. He stated that his wife was not a distraction. He declared that she was the absolute foundation of the family, the reason the empire existed, and the only reason any of them were allowed to breathe his air. He promised, with cold, unyielding certainty, that the next man who spoke her name without absolute reverence would lose his tongue and his life. Tiernan released his grip, letting Vance's head loll to the side, leaving a thick smear of blood across the expensive mahogany. Vance slid out of his chair and collapsed onto the floor, a gasping, whimpering mess, clutching his shattered face. Tiernan stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate suit, completely unfazed by the violence he had just unleashed. He looked at the terrified capos huddled at the edges of the room. He told them the dinner was over. The men did not speak. They did not look at Vance bleeding on the floor. They moved with frantic, silent urgency, practically running toward the heavy oak doors to escape the suffocating terror of the glass fortress. When the doors finally closed behind the last man, the penthouse fell into a deep, ringing silence. Garrick stepped into the dining room, his massive frame blocking the exit, his eyes locked onto the pathetic form of Vance on the floor. Tiernan ordered Garrick to have the trash removed and the floor scrubbed. He turned and walked away from the table, his heavy footsteps echoing down the marble hallway toward the private wing. Sienna stepped out of the shadows to meet him. She looked at the fresh blood splattered across the knuckles of his right hand. She did not feel fear. She felt a dark, profound sense of awe at the terrifying lengths this man would go to protect her. Tiernan stopped in front of her, his chest heaving slightly, the violent energy slowly draining from his body. He reached out with his clean hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. He whispered that the old guard was broken, that the transition was secure, and that they were finally safe. But the illusion of safety was a fragile, temporary ghost. The next morning, the gray lights howled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a penthouse that had been converted into a war room. The atmosphere was electric with a new, terrifying tension. Heavily armed men in dark suits paced the perimeter of the living room, their rifles held at the ready. Garrick stood near the private elevator, his massive arms crossed, his face a mask of furious, paranoid concentration. Sienna walked out of the master suite, wearing a thick robe, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach. She felt the shift in the air immediately. The quiet victory of the previous night had vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating panic of a breached fortress. Tiernan was standing by the massive kitchen island, his broad back to her. He was staring down at a small, square package resting on the pristine white marble counter. The package had bypassed the lower security desk, slipped past the armed guards in the garage, and arrived directly at their private door. It was a catastrophic failure of their invisible shield. Sienna walked slowly toward the island, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She asked Tiernan what had happened, her voice barely a whisper in the tense silence of the room. Tiernan did not look up. His massive hands were resting flat on the marble on either side of the open box. His knuckles were white, the tendons in his arms pulled so tight they looked ready to snap. Sienna reached his side and looked down into the small cardboard box. Resting on a bed of black tissue paper was a baby rattle. It was made of tarnished silver, old and heavy, the metal dull and scratched. Tied tightly around the handle of the rattle was a dark red ribbon, the color of dried blood. The implication hit Sienna with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and sending a wave of pure ice through her veins. The enemy knew. Vance's humiliation had triggered a catastrophic leak, or perhaps the rival factions had been watching them closer than they ever realized. The secret was out, and the microscopic fuse of life inside her was now the ultimate target in a syndicate war. Tiernan slowly turned his head to look at her. The profound, rumbling tenderness that usually softened his features when he looked at her was completely gone. His eyes were molten, burning with the apocalyptic, unyielding fire of impending war. The immovable king had realized that his glass fortress was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. He reached out and gripped her upper arms, his touch firm, urgent, and terrifyingly cold. He told her, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked absolutely no argument, that she had exactly 1 hour to pack her bags. The 60 minutes that followed were a blur of calculated, terrifying efficiency. Sienna moved through the massive walk-in closet of the master suite like a ghost. Her hands trembled as she pulled thick wool sweaters, heavy denim, and practical boots from the pristine, illuminated shelves. She was leaving behind the silk, the cashmere, and the delicate heels that had defined her role as the untouchable queen of the glass fortress. She was packing for survival. Every time she zipped a duffel bag, the metallic rasp sounded like a scream in the suffocating silence of the penthouse. She remembered packing like this once before, years ago, in a cramped, freezing apartment on the south side. Back then, she had been throwing cheap clothes into a garbage bag, terrified that Braden would wake up from his drunken stupor and catch her trying to escape. But this was entirely different. She was not running from a pathetic, abusive coward. She was being evacuated from a war zone by an army of men in tailored suits, hiding from a syndicate faction that wanted to extinguish the microscopic life growing inside her. Tiernan did not pack. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the bedroom, his broad back to her, staring out at the weeping, gray city. He was a monolithic silhouette of impending violence. He was orchestrating a simultaneous, decapitating strike on the rival leadership and the treacherous factions within his own ranks. He was going to burn the city down to ensure her safety, and he was going to do it from the center of the storm. When Garrick appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space, he gave a single, sharp nod. The convoy was ready. Tiernan turned away from the window and walked over to Sienna. He did not pull her into a desperate embrace or offer hollow promises that everything would be fine. He reached out and cupped her face with both of his large, scarred hands. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unyielding intensity. He told her that Garrick would not leave her side for a single second. He swore that the moment the streets were clean, he would come for her. Sienna placed her hands over his, feeling the steady, terrifying pulse of the apex predator beneath his skin. She whispered that he needed to come back to them, her voice breaking on the final word as she pressed her hand to her stomach. Tiernan leaned down and pressed a hard, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a seal, a vow, and a goodbye all at once. He stepped back, the warmth of his touch vanishing, leaving her shivering in the cold, air-conditioned air of the bedroom. Garrick picked up her heavy duffel bags, as if they weighed nothing at all. He led her out of the penthouse, down the private elevator, and into the subterranean parking garage. 3 heavily armored, matte black sport utility vehicles were idling in a tight formation, their engines a low, vibrating growl against the concrete walls. A dozen heavily armed men stood in a perimeter, their eyes scanning the shadows, their hands resting on the grips of concealed automatic weapons. Garrick opened the heavy rear door of the center vehicle. Sienna climbed inside, the thick, reinforced steel door slamming shut behind her with a definitive, vault-like thud. The cabin was a soundproof cage of dark leather and tinted glass. Garrick slid into the driver's seat, his massive shoulders blocking her view of the windshield. He spoke into a small radio clipped to his lapel, his voice a low, gravelly command. The heavy steel gates of the garage rolled open, and the convoy surged forward into the relentless New England storm. The drive was an agonizing, claustrophobic nightmare. They left the hyper-modern, ultra-wealthy financial district behind, the towering glass monoliths disappearing into the low-hanging fog. They bypassed the decaying, rust-belt industrial sectors of the South Side entirely, taking a secured, elevated expressway out of the maritime metropolis. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the vehicle, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that mirrored the hammering of Sienna's heart. For the first hour, the radio crackled with terse, coded updates from the lead and trail vehicles. But as they pushed further west, leaving the city limits and entering the dense, winding roads of the state, the radio fell silent. The landscape outside the tinted windows transformed from concrete overpasses to towering black pine trees. They were heading deep into the Berkshires, a sprawling, mountainous region of dense forests and isolated valleys. The roads became narrow and slick with mud, the heavy tires of the armored vehicles fighting for traction on the steep inclines. Sienna sat in the back seat, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. The nausea of her early pregnancy was amplified by the swaying motion of the heavy vehicle and the suffocating dread pooling in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the steady, rhythmic hum of the engine, but her mind kept flashing back to the tarnished silver rattle, the dark red ribbon, the color of dried blood. Vance had sold them out. The arrogant, flashy capo who ran the East Side ports had decided that Tiernan's push for legitimate business was a weakness. He had decided that the unborn child was the ultimate leverage to seize control of the syndicate. Sienna opened her eyes and looked at the back of Garrick's thick, tattooed neck. She asked him, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the rain, where they were going. Garrick did not turn his head. His eyes remained locked on the treacherous, winding road ahead. He stated flatly that they were going to a secure location, an off-the-grid asset that did not exist on any county registry or property deed. He told her it was a place built specifically for the end of the world. 2 hours later, the convoy turned off the paved mountain road onto a deeply rutted, hidden dirt path. The heavy vehicles pushed through thick, overgrown brush, the branches scraping violently against the armor plating. They descended into a steep, heavily forested ravine, the canopy of black pines so dense that it blocked out the gray afternoon light. At the bottom of the ravine, built directly into the side of a sheer granite cliff, was the safe house. It was not a rustic cabin or a luxurious mountain retreat. It was a brutalist masterpiece of poured concrete, reinforced steel, and dark, mirrored glass. It looked like a military bunker, a monolithic gray scar against the natural beauty of the wet forest. The convoy pulled into a covered concrete bay. The heavy steel doors of the garage rolled shut behind them, plunging the space into total darkness before harsh, fluorescent overhead lights flickered on. Garrick killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. He turned in his seat, his massive frame shifting the suspension of the vehicle, and looked at Sienna. He told her they had arrived, and instructed her to stay close to him as they moved inside. Sienna stepped out of the vehicle, the cold, damp air of the concrete bay biting through her heavy wool sweater. The other men from the convoy fanned out, their boots echoing sharply against the floor as they secured the perimeter. Garrick led her to a massive, solid steel blast door set into the concrete wall. He punched a long, complicated sequence of numbers into a biometric keypad, followed by a retinal scan. Heavy, internal deadbolts clacked loudly, a mechanical sound of absolute, unforgiving security. The door swung open on silent, perfectly oiled hinges. The interior of the bunker was exactly as cold and sterile as the exterior promised. The walls were exposed, polished concrete. The floors were dark slate. The furniture was sparse, functional, and devoid of any warmth or comfort. It was a place designed for survival, not for living. Garrick escorted her to the main living area, a large, sunken room dominated by a bank of high-definition security monitors. The screens displayed dozens of different angles of the surrounding forest, the access road, and the perimeter fence. Nothing moved on the screens except the relentless driving rain. Garrick dropped her duffel bags near a heavy leather sofa and turned to face his men. He issued a series of rapid, low commands. 2 men were sent to the roof access. 2 men were stationed in the subterranean generator room. The rest were ordered to establish a rotating patrol of the immediate tree line. Within minutes, the men dispersed, leaving Sienna and Garrick alone in the cavernous main room. The waiting game began. It was an agonizing, psychological torture that stretched the minutes into hours. The silence of the bunker was heavy and unnatural, broken only by the low, constant hum of the massive air filtration system. Sienna paced the length of the dark slate floor, her boots making soft, rhythmic scuffing sounds. She felt like a ghost haunting a concrete tomb. She felt the crushing weight of being the asset, the fragile package that had to be hidden away while men bled and died in the city to protect her. She walked into the small, industrial kitchen and tried to force herself to eat. She found a box of dry crackers in the heavily stocked pantry and poured a glass of filtered water. She sat at the stainless steel island, staring blankly at the blank concrete wall. Every time she tried to swallow, her throat throbbed with a dull, phantom ache, a lingering reminder of Braden's filthy fingers crushing her windpipe. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the slight, almost imperceptible firmness beneath her jeans. She whispered a silent, desperate promise to the microscopic life inside her. She promised that she would not let the darkness of this world consume them. She promised that Tiernan would build the clean, sunlit boardroom he had sworn to create. She walked back into the main room. Garrick was sitting at a heavy metal table near the security monitors. He had stripped off his wet jacket, revealing the thick, dark tribal tattoos that crawled up his neck and down his massive, corded arms. He was methodically, surgically cleaning his weapons. A heavy, matte black automatic rifle lay in pieces on a dark cloth. Beside it was a pair of high-capacity handguns and a half-dozen loaded magazines. The smell of sharp chemical solvent and gun oil filled the room, a harsh, metallic scent that made Sienna's stomach churn. Garrick moved with the terrifying, mechanical efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for violence. He wiped down a heavy steel bolt, his massive fingers handling the delicate internal mechanisms with surprising grace. The metallic clicks and snaps of the weapons being reassembled were the only sounds in the room. It was a metronome of anxiety, a constant ticking reminder that the invisible shield around them could shatter at any moment. Sienna sat on the edge of the leather sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. She watched the security monitors. The gray afternoon had bled into a pitch-black night. The cameras switched to thermal imaging, displaying the dense pine forest in eerie, glowing shades of white and gray. The rain continued to fall, a relentless, white static across the screens. She asked Garrick, her voice breaking the heavy silence, if he had heard anything from the city. Garrick slid a loaded magazine into the grip of a handgun with a sharp, definitive crack. He did not look up from the table. He stated that silence was the protocol. He explained that Tiernan was executing a highly coordinated, multi-target strike against Vance's loyalists and the rival leadership. Any communication, any encrypted ping, could be intercepted and used to trace their location. He told her that no news was good news, but the silence felt like a suffocating blanket. Sienna laid her head back against the leather cushion and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally dragging her down into a shallow, restless sleep. She dreamed of shattered glass, dark red ribbons, and the smell of stale grease. She was jolted awake by a sound that defied description. It was a deep, structural groan, a massive vibration that shook the concrete floor beneath her boots. Before she could even process the noise, the harsh fluorescent lights of the bunker flickered violently and died. The cavernous room was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Sienna gasped, her hands flying to her stomach, her heart instantly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. A second later, the emergency backup generator kicked in with a deep, mechanical roar. The bunker was suddenly bathed in a harsh, pulsing red light. The emergency lighting cast long, demonic shadows across the concrete walls, turning the sterile safe house into a slaughterhouse. Garrick was already moving. He had the heavy automatic rifle in his hands, his massive frame positioned between Sienna and the reinforced blast doors. He stared at the bank of security monitors. Half of the screens were dead, displaying nothing but jagged white static. The remaining thermal cameras showed a terrifying reality. The perimeter had been breached. Glowing white figures, moving with highly trained, tactical precision, were swarming the tree line. They were not street-level thugs. They were a professional, heavily armed assault team. Vance had not just sold their coordinates. He had hired ghosts to do the killing. Garrick hit a button on his radio, his voice a sharp, barking command to the men stationed outside. There was no response, only the hiss of dead air. The outer perimeter guards were already dead. Garrick turned to Sienna, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying focus in the red light. He ordered her to get behind the heavy steel island in the kitchen and to stay as close to the floor as possible. He told her that under no circumstances was she to make a sound. Sienna scrambled across the dark slate floor, her boots slipping slightly in her panic. She threw herself behind the thick stainless steel barrier, curling into a tight ball, her hands covering her ears. The silence that followed was the most agonizing moment of her life. It was the deep breath before the plunge. Then, the front of the bunker exploded. The acoustic shock of the breach was catastrophic. A highly concentrated, shaped charge detonated against the reinforced glass windows of the upper observation deck. The explosion tore through the bunker, a deafening physical wave of pressure that knocked the breath from Sienna's lungs. Thick, choking dust and pulverized concrete rained down from the ceiling. The sound of shattering glass and twisting metal echoed endlessly in the cavernous space. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the firefight erupted. It was a chaotic, deafening symphony of violence. The sharp, rapid crack of incoming assault rifles was answered by the heavy, booming roar of Garrick's weapon. Sienna squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling violently against the cold steel of the kitchen island. The smell of burnt cordite, pulverized concrete, and sharp copper flooded the air, a toxic, suffocating mixture. She heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the slate floor. The assault team had breached the main room. Garrick was a machine. He moved with terrifying speed, his massive frame shifting through the red-lit dust like an apex predator. He fired in short, controlled bursts. Sienna heard a man scream, followed by the heavy, wet sound of a body collapsing onto the slate. Garrick had taken down the first attacker. The incoming fire intensified, a relentless hail of bullets sparking off the concrete walls and shattering the remaining security monitors. Garrick fell back, taking cover behind a thick, reinforced concrete pillar near the hallway. He reloaded his weapon with a sharp metallic clack, his breathing heavy and controlled. He leaned out to fire again. A deafening crack echoed through the room, distinct from the automatic fire. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of a high-caliber sniper rifle firing from the tree line through the breached window. Sienna heard a sickening, wet impact. Garrick let out a sharp, guttural grunt of pain. His massive body was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the round. He crashed heavily onto the slate floor, his automatic rifle clattering out of his hands and sliding across the room. Sienna opened her eyes, peering around the edge of the steel island. Through the swirling red-lit dust, she saw Garrick. He was pinned down behind the concrete pillar, clutching his left shoulder. Dark, thick blood was pouring through his fingers, pooling rapidly on the dark slate floor. The high-caliber round had shattered his collarbone and torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder. He was severely wounded, his left arm completely useless. He gritted his teeth, his face pale and sweating in the emergency light, and reached for the handgun holstered at his hip with his right hand. But he was too slow. A third attacker stepped through the shattered remains of the observation deck. He was dressed in full tactical gear, his face obscured by a black ballistic mask. He moved with cold, methodical precision. Stepping over the body of his dead comrade, he raised his assault rifle, the laser sight cutting a bright, terrifying red line through the dust. He aimed directly at Garrick's chest. Time stopped. The universe contracted into a single, agonizing point of absolute clarity. Sienna stared at the laser sight resting on the chest of the man who had sworn to protect her. She saw the attacker's finger tightening on the trigger. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the woman Sienna used to be died completely. The cowering victim who had spent years shrinking away from violence. The woman who had let Braden crush her windpipe in a filthy diner. Vanished. She was replaced by something primal, ancient, and terrifying. It was the roaring, absolute need of a mother to protect her bloodline. She was carrying the heir to a syndicate king, and she refused to let her child be born into a world where their protectors were slaughtered on the floor. Sienna looked down. Resting on the slate floor, just 2 feet away from her hiding spot, was the heavy automatic rifle Garrick had dropped when he was hit. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She lunged forward, her hands closing around the cold, textured grip of the weapon. It was incredibly heavy, the metal cold and unforgiving. She dragged it back behind the island, her fingers frantically searching for the safety mechanism Garrick had shown her months ago in a sterile, brightly lit shooting range. She found the switch and flicked it off. She rose from behind the steel island, stepping out into the open red-lit room. The third attacker heard the movement. He began to pivot, his rifle swinging away from Garrick and toward the new threat. But Sienna was already aiming. She raised the heavy weapon, the stock pressing painfully into her bruised shoulder. She did not close her eyes. She stared directly at the black ballistic mask of the man who had come to kill her child. She pulled the trigger. The recoil was a violent physical blow that nearly knocked her off her feet. The deafening roar of the rifle shattered the remaining glass in the kitchen. The heavy caliber round struck the attacker dead center in the chest, punching through his tactical vest with devastating kinetic force. He was thrown backward, his weapon firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed onto the slate floor. He did not move again. The sudden silence in the bunker was absolute, ringing loudly in Sienna's ears. She stood frozen in the center of the room, the heavy rifle still raised, her chest heaving with frantic, ragged breaths. The smell of burnt powder and fresh blood was suffocating. She stared at the body of the man she had just killed. The psychological weight of crossing that line crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She had taken a life. She had stepped over the invisible boundary that separated the innocent from the monsters. Her hands began to shake violently, the heavy rifle slipping from her grip and clattering onto the floor. She dropped to her knees, her hands flying to her face as a raw, tearing sob ripped from her throat. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rushing, terrifying wave. Garrick pushed himself up against the concrete pillar, his face pale, his hand still clamped over his bleeding shoulder. He looked at the dead attacker, and then he looked at Sienna. His eyes, usually cold and mechanical, were filled with a profound, unspoken awe. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her the perimeter was still hot, but the words were cut off by the sound of heavy engines roaring down the access road. Tires screeched against the wet pavement outside the garage. Doors slammed. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed through the concrete bay. The massive steel blast doors of the bunker were violently thrown open. Tiernan breached the room. He was a terrifying vision of absolute destruction. His immaculate charcoal suit was ruined, torn and heavily stained with dark, drying blood. His face was smeared with soot and rain, his dark eyes wide and frantic as they swept the devastated, red-lit room. He saw the shattered glass. He saw Garrick bleeding against the pillar. He saw the dead men on the floor. And then, he saw Sienna. She was kneeling on the slate floor, shaking violently, the heavy rifle resting at her feet. The immovable king, the terrifying apex predator who had just orchestrated the slaughter of dozens of men in the city, completely broke. He dropped his weapon. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides and fell to his knees in front of her. He pulled her into his chest, his large, blood-stained hands wrapping around her, crushing her against him with a desperate, agonizing relief. He buried his face in her neck, his broad shoulders shaking as he inhaled the scent of her hair. He did not care about the blood on his suit or the dust in the air. He only cared that she was breathing. Sienna wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking into the ruined fabric of his jacket. She whispered, her voice broken and raspy, that she had killed a man. Tiernan pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. He looked deep into her eyes, seeing the profound psychological trauma, the terrifying realization of what she had become. He brushed the concrete dust from her cheek with his thumb. He told her, his voice a deep, rumbling vibration of absolute certainty, that she had not killed a man. He told her she had protected their family. He stated that Vance was dead. He confirmed that the rival leadership had been entirely dismantled, their bodies left in the burning wreckage of the East Side ports. He swore to her, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire, that the war was over. The old blood had been washed away. The syndicate was clean. He pulled her back against his chest, resting his large hand firmly over her stomach, shielding the microscopic life inside her from the horrors of the room. He held her in the red emergency light of the brutalist bunker, a king holding his queen in the ashes of the underworld he had destroyed for her. 7 months later, the afternoon sunlight poured through the large, arched windows of the nursery, painting the hardwood floor in warm, golden hues. The room was a masterpiece of soft pastel colors, plush rugs, and absolute, unbroken peace. It smelled of baby powder, fresh linen, and the faint, sweet scent of the blooming oak trees outside the window. The dark, violent world of the maritime metropolis and the cold, concrete bunker in the Berkshires felt like a distant, fading nightmare. They were in Connecticut now, living in a sprawling, heavily secured estate surrounded by acres of private forest. Tiernan had kept his vow. He had fully legitimized the empire. The blood money had been washed clean through massive, untouchable global logistics contracts. The syndicate was now a corporate monolith, operating in sunlit boardrooms rather than dark, rain-swept alleys. Sienna stood in the doorway of the nursery, leaning against the white wooden frame. She was wearing a simple, flowing white dress, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. The haunted, distant look that had once clouded her eyes was completely gone. She was no longer a cowering victim, and she was no longer a terrified asset hiding in a bunker. She was a mother, fiercely protective, deeply grounded, and finally free of the shadows. She watched her husband. Tiernan was sitting in a large, comfortable rocking chair near the window. He was wearing a soft, gray cashmere sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the faded, jagged scars on his forearms. The terrifying, cold menace that used to define his every movement had been replaced by a profound, rumbling tenderness. He was holding their newborn son. The baby was tiny, wrapped in a soft white blanket, his small chest rising and falling in a deep, peaceful sleep. Tiernan's massive, scarred hands cradled the infant with a terrifyingly gentle reverence. He was staring down at the sleeping face of his son, his dark eyes filled with an overwhelming, absolute devotion. He was a man who had torn down his own underworld, who had waded through a river of blood and fire just to build this fortress of love. Sienna walked quietly across the sunlit room. She stopped beside the rocking chair and rested her hand gently on Tiernan's broad shoulder. He looked up at her, a slow, breathtaking smile softening the hard lines of his face. He shifted his arm, allowing her to lean down and press a soft kiss to the top of their son's head. Sienna looked out the window, watching the wind rustle the green leaves of the oak trees. She felt the solid, unyielding warmth of her husband beside her, and the quiet, steady breathing of the child they had fought so hard to protect. The war was truly over. The glass fortress had been replaced by a real home, and for the first time in her life, Sienna was no longer afraid of the future.